Hey everybody, in the previous lesson we went over how we can create this bottle, and one thing that we missed is how to create the label for that. It's a very simple process. All that I did was trace the shape of the label from our reference and made sure that it has enough topology so that we can curve it along the surface of the bottle. The way that we do that is by adding a shrink wrap modifier and then adding a solidify modifier for the thickness. Also, there are a few things that we need to tweak in the shrink wrap modifier. The first thing is that instead of using the default setting, which is nearest surface point, we switch to project and use the y-axis. That way we make sure there is no deformation on the sticker. Let me show you. Once we switch to nearest surface point, as you can see, the sticker will get deformed a little bit, and that is because of the curvature of the bottle itself. So that's why we're using project, and we're projecting on the y-axis. Okay, now let's go into creating the UVs for our objects and the actual textures, as there will be some textures that we need to create manually. For that, I will create a second working space and switch to the UV editor. Of course, I will also start from the easiest to the hardest parts of the model, and the easiest one is the label. So first I will select all of the UVs, hit UV and just select unwrap, and we're pretty much done. In order to finish the job, let's actually create a shader and add a texture to that shader. I will use the texture that I found on the internet for that particular brand. So let's load that. And in order to preview it in my 3D viewport, I'll just make sure that the colors are from material switched to texture so that we can see what exactly we're doing. Okay, now we can maximize our UV space, and from here we can just match the UV islands onto the texture. So just a little bit of a rotation and scale along the y-axis should be enough to match the UV island perfectly. Great. Also make sure that there are no vertices going into the white parts of the texture so that we don't have any weird effects happening on the edges of our model. Great. The next one that is very easy is just UV mapping the cap. Now, usually with models like that, you might want to create custom UVs, add seams, etc., and figure out a way how to unwrap it. But there is a very easy way to handle models like that, especially when they're made of wood. So let's give it a material, and I will load the wood texture that I will be using. So this is a simple bump texture. Right now it doesn't look very convincing, but all we need to do to make it look better is just select everything and project it from view using bounds. Okay, that still doesn't look great, but to fix it we need to actually adjust the rotation of our UV island, and of course the positioning. We can play also with the scale until we get the result that we want, and there. As you can see, we have a well unwrapped model that actually matches the reference quite well. Now onto the more difficult parts, and the parts where we need to create actual UV islands and we need to create custom textures for them, will be the bottle itself and the leather strap. For the bottle, I like to create a displacement map so that we can replicate the roses on the surface of the bottle, and to do that I will go into GIMP, but you can also use Photoshop. So I already have an image with the logo in black and white, so I'll just load that, and using this as a starting point I will create the displacement map. Now first of all I want to cut out everything that I'm not going to use in that texture, so let's just make sure that our crop isn't adding anything additional, keeping textures optimized is actually key to having quick and snappy rendering experience. Okay, so let's crop that using crop to selection. And now what I want to do is have the background in black and the parts that I want sticking out, like in the reference, to be in white. So for that, I will use my brush. I'll switch to a black color and I'll make sure I have a relatively small size, as I want to paint in any kind of holes that we have in the silhouette of our image. Great, this is one, and there was another one here. Great. One thing that I'm going to do is just bring up the contrast, because I want to get rid of any kind of artifacts. As you can see, there are some gray spots here from the JPEG artifacts, and I really want to get rid of that. So let's crank up the contrast and also bring in the brightness. As you can see, if we lower the brightness, the black islands start to be bigger and they're taking more space, and we're starting to see the artifacts. I'm going to crank up the brightness quite a bit until we get the smallest black islands possible. Okay, cool. Now let's fill the whole background using the bucket tool and fill it with black. Great, now we have a really good starting point for our displacement texture, but one thing that is important when creating displacement textures is knowing how displacement actually works. So if we have a sharp transition like that from black to white, we will have a very sharp transition in the displacement. So that's why we need to actually blur it so that we have a soft shape. So for example, if we look at the reference, you can see that the shapes of the roses are very smooth. Everything is transitioning very gently from one shape to the other. So we don't want any hard transition between black and white. So let's go into filters, blur, and use Gaussian blur. Now the size of the blur will depend on the effect that you're going for, but for this image I think something bigger actually works better. Okay, maybe slightly bigger than that. Now another thing that I want to take care of is I want to make sure that most of my geometry doesn't get displaced, and in order to do that we want the texture to have a base color of gray, of exactly 50% gray. So for that I will create a new layer, use again my bucket tool, and select a color that is 50% gray. Let's fill that layer and bring our roses on top of that. From here we can just set the blending mode either to screen or to lighten only. Now as you can see, the base of our image is 50% gray and everything else is brighter from here. So it's either 50% gray or up until pure white. Great, let's export that, and I'll name it for convenience something like roses displacement texture, and we can go back into Blender. I'll just make sure that the quality is set to high. Great, so to preview that texture, let's create a new material. Again, hit Ctrl T to add a texture with mapping coordinates, and let's open up our displacement. Okay, now it looks quite silly, but in order to fix that, let's jump into the UVs. And right now what I've done is I've just reset all of the UVs, so you can hit U and reset, and each one of those polygons will be mapped onto the UV island. So let's take all of that and scale it to 0. We don't really want it, and bring it somewhere where we have a gray color. Now we want to map our roses onto this part of our model, so let's select all of those faces. In order to select them like that, I'm just hitting the first polygon I want, holding Control and hitting the last polygon that I want. That way Blender selects everything in between those polygons. Okay, now we can hit U and just select Unwrap. Great, actually that already looks pretty good. Maybe we can play a little bit with the scale, or Yeah, just slightly smaller scale. Yeah, that looks good. Now let's add the displacement. Actually, let's just adjust it a little bit. Yeah. Great, now that looks quite like the reference, and the positioning is the same, and the size also almost looks the same. Now let's add displacement. For displacement to work inside of Blender, we need to go to the rendering settings, and from the feature set, select experimental. Then on the model, we want a subdivision modifier set to adaptive subdivision. And keep in mind, if you're not seeing the adaptive subdivision setting here, it's most likely because you haven't selected the experimental feature set. Now, when we go into materials, we can go to the settings of the material and we can change the displacement from bump only into displacement only. I'll do that in a second. First, I'd like to set up the displacement in the shader. So let's add a displacement node and connect the displacement output to the material output node, and we can take the color of our roses displacement and set it into the height, and we can disconnect it from the color. Now we can start rendering inside of the viewport. Okay, right now everything is gray because the world setting is set to gray, and I'm not really gonna bother with lighting right now. I'll just use one of the default settings in Blender and just select an HDRI that I like. So for example, this interior one. Then, as you can see, we have some sort of an effect, but it's not really displacing any of the geometry. And that's because we need to go into the material, open settings, and switch from in the material settings, go to settings and switch from bump only to displacement only. Okay, now everything will get displaced in every direction, which is something that we don't want. We precisely made the color, the base color of our image mid-gray, so that we don't get that effect. The reason why we're getting it is because right now our image is loaded in sRGB color space, which is applying basically a curve modifier onto our texture, and it's not reading the correct values off of it. If we switch it to raw or non-color, things will change, and now we have the correct values. And as you can see, everything that is mapped with gray color isn't actually being pushed, it's actually staying in the same place, and we need to take care of the part that's the roses. So in order to do that, let's dial in the scale, and I will put in something very low, like 1 millimeter. Okay, this looks good, but we need a little bit higher. So let's try to 3 millimeters. Okay, that's looking better. And also right now the displacement is a bit choppy. One thing that you can do is, once you zoom in, you can hit tab to enter edit mode and exit after that, and this will update the displacement, because that type of displacement is actually view dependent. So if we were looking at it from afar, once you hit tab, you see that it will recalculate everything and we'll have low quality again. Now don't worry about that, this is only the behavior in the viewport. If we want to change that, we can go into render settings, then go into subdivision, and from subdivision we can change the dicing scale from 8 for the viewport to something like 2. Try not to go too low, because this will eat up your memory fairly quickly. So if we hit tab again, you can see now that we have a much higher quality displacement. Okay, great. Now we're left with just one of the models, which is our leather strap. For that, we need to create a UV islands, and this means we need to actually add seams to our object. Now, I will isolate it and start creating the UV islands. First thing that I want is, I want to make sure there is a seam everywhere where there is a planar transition. So for example, we'll think of these faces and the adjacent to them as one plane, these are another one, and these are another one. Basically everywhere where you have a sharp corner there is a planar change. One way to select all of the edges that separate the planes is by selecting one of them, hitting Shift G, and then we can pick to select similar using face angles. Now at the moment the selection might not be full, but that will depend on the threshold. If we have a very low threshold, we will actually see very few edges being selected, and if we increase the threshold, we will get more and more edges being selected. Okay, right now we have pretty much everything that we want, and I will hit Ctrl E and mark everything as seen. Now we can select everything and hit U and unwrap. Great. Now there are a few islands that I want to take care of. One is this one, which is actually correspondent to these. The other ones that I want to take care of are here, the ones that are curved. I actually want them straight so that once we map the texture, it curves with the geometry rather than it looks just projected directly onto it. Now, in order to do that, I will hit this button, which is syncing what I'm doing in the 3D viewport with what is happening in the UV space. So now, once I select something here, it gets selected in the 3D viewport. I'll make sure that I'm in faces mode, and what I'm going to do is just reset those islands, then select follow active quads as an unwrapping method. And this will give me a nice straight strip of polygons. Of course, I need to match the ratio of the polygons, so the general proportions, and by the looks of it, they are twice as wide as they're long. So let's scale that 2 times on the x-axis, and from here I'm just going to pack those islands. The way that I do that is I have a shortcut applied to my quick select, applied to my favorites, and that is from UVs. There is average island scale and there is pack islands. What you need to do is just right click and add them to your favorites, or in my case just remove them. Okay, so we have one island ready. Then we can pick the next one and make sure you have an active quad selected. Again, let's reset everything, then follow active quads, pack islands, and we need to scale it so that it matches the correct aspect ratio. Great. There are a few more left, and I'll just keep selecting them and doing the same thing with each and every one of them. So I don't think there's a need of narration for that. Okay, now that we have everything unwrapped, let's select everything. I will hit average island scale and I'll hit pack islands. That way I will make sure all of those islands are in the same scale and they relatively fit in my they fit in my UV space. Also, one thing that I want to do with the pack island settings is just tweak the margin a little bit. I just want a little bit of space between all of those islands so that there isn't any texture overlap on where the seams are. Another thing that I'll do is just rotate them 90 degrees and place them here in the upper corner of the UV space. Now, because I want to paint custom textures for those UV islands, I actually need to export the UV layout. So to do that, we can go to UVs, and from here, if we go to the top, or in most cases it will be at the bottom, so depending on how your UI is set up, you can go to export UV layout, select a name, something, you can pick the resolution, and select export UV layout. Now in just a second I'll open it again in GIMP, but like I said, you can use Photoshop, it's pretty much the same. Great, so here we have loaded the UV layout. I'll create a new layer and fill it with mid-gray color, bring the UV layout on top, and I'll create a third layer that I want to place beneath the UV layouts. Now from here we can start selecting things and painting into them using, for example, black or white, depending on what kind of pattern we want to create. And for that particular image I've already created some designs and I'll just load them in so that you can see. So yeah, this is the texture that I've painted. As you can see, I've used the brand name alongside with the displacement texture that I made for the bottle and mix them up to create this. Now let's load it in and create the displacement for that object too, and that will be a wrap. Okay, so let's get out of the isolation mode, create a new material for the strap, again bring in the texture that we want. Great, make sure that we set it to sRGB. I'm sorry, to set it from sRGB into non-color data, and create our displacement node, of course. Set that to the height, drag it into the displacement, and we can start rendering so that we see what's going on. Okay, so right now we're still getting just the bump information, and for that we're going to go into the material settings just like we did before and switch from bump only to displacement only. Great, now everything is going all over the place. So what do we need to do? Again, lower the scale. And another thing that we want to do is actually match the UVs to our island. As you can see, in order to save some texture space, I've cut out everything that I don't need from the initial texture, because if you remember, in our UV layout, in our initial UV layout, we had all this space basically sitting useless here. So I cropped that out. And to fix that, all I need to do is just play with the scale of the UV islands. So I'm going to scale them until they roughly fit the shape of my design. Great. Okay, that looks okay. Let me just switch to a different HDRI because this one is a bit too harsh. Great. And one thing that I want to do also is make sure that in my subdivision modifier I go from the regular subdivision to adaptive subdivision. There, now we're having all the detail that we want. And let's just play with the UV placing just a little bit more so that we match the reference closer, and we have everything nice and symmetrical. And great, with that we have finished texturing our model and creating all the UVs that we need. And in the next lesson we will cover how we can create the shaders, and if we have time we will take a look at the lighting. Thanks for watching.